Hello, and welcome back to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we dive into a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is January 5th. Today's episode is about a tragic murder that shocked a small town and eventually led to the capture of one of New England's most notorious serial killers. We're talking about the murder of Tammy Williams in 1982. She was killed by Michael Bruce Ross, a man who terrorized the area for years. So let's get into the details of this case and how it ultimately did lead to justice. It was a cold January day in 1982 when 17-year-old Tammy Williams set out for a walk in Brooklyn, Connecticut. She was a typical high school senior, thinking about her future and enjoying the last few months before graduation. But that afternoon, she crossed paths with someone whose intentions were far from innocent. That someone was Michael Bruce Ross, a name that would soon become infamous throughout the region. Tammy's walk that day turned out to be her last. Ross abducted her, taking her to a secluded area where he then raped and strangled her. He later admitted that he had targeted Tammy simply because she was walking alone. It's every woman's worst nightmare that your life could just end because you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time with nobody around you. When Tammy didn't come home that evening, her family knew that something was wrong. They reported her missing to the police, but at first, there were few clues as to where she could be. Then, several days later, Tammy's body was found in a nearby wooded area. The discovery devastated her family and the small community of Brooklyn, Connecticut. In the days and weeks after Tammy's murder, the police tried to piece together what little evidence they had. But there really wasn't much to go on, and Michael Ross wasn't even on their radar yet. The community was left in fear, wondering who could have committed such a horrible crime in their small town. Was it somebody who was just passing through? Or was it somebody who was among them? Detectives interviewed Tammy's friends and neighbors, trying to find anyone who might have seen something, but no one had a solid lead. Now, you've got to remember that back then, DNA technology was in its very early days. So police really just had to rely on witness statements and whatever physical evidence they could find at the crime scene. Unfortunately, what they did find was mostly circumstantial, and the case hit a dead end. Without any strong leads, the investigation into Tammy's murder began to go cold. For Tammy's family, the thought of her killer still being out there was heartbreaking, and it would take years before the truth finally came out. So who was Michael Bruce Ross? On the surface, he seemed like a fairly normal, well-educated man. He grew up in Connecticut on a chicken farm, and despite a difficult childhood, he excelled in school, eventually attending Cornell University. There, he studied agricultural economics, and he appeared to have a promising future. But behind his outwardly normal life, Ross was hiding dark fantasies. After college, he returned to Connecticut and worked as an insurance salesman. But his thoughts and these dark fantasies, they kept on growing, and eventually he began to act on them. By 1981, he had started hunting for victims. Tammy Williams' murder in January 1982 was the first in what would become a series of brutal killings. Ross later admitted that he felt no guilt for what he had done. Instead, he described the feeling as a release, like he had satisfied his twisted needs. Over the next 2 years, he continued targeting young women who, like Tammy, were alone and vulnerable. Between 1982 and 1984, Michael Ross murdered at least 7 young women across Connecticut and New York. Each time, he followed a similar pattern. He abducted them, sexually assaulted them, and then strangled his victims. The women he targeted were all young, ranging from their teens to their early 20s. The authorities initially struggled to connect the dots between these cases. Ross carefully selected his victims and chose times and places where he would not be seen. His caution helped him avoid capture for years, even as his list of victims grew longer. It wasn't until 1984 that Ross was finally caught, and even then, it wasn't for one of his murders. He was arrested after trying to abduct a young woman, and that arrest was the break that the police needed. Once in custody, he began to confess. He detailed his involvement in all of the murders, including Tammy Williams's. His confessions were horribly detailed and described exactly how he lured each victim and took their lives. So they had his confessions, and the police decided to charge Michael Ross with multiple counts of murder, including Tammy Williams's. The trial that followed, of course, was closely followed by the community. People who watched the trial said that Ross clearly understood the gravity of his actions, but showed no remorse. Ross's defense team argued that he suffered from severe mental illnesses, suggesting that his behavior stemmed from deep-rooted psychological issues. They brought in experts to testify about Ross's troubled childhood and his inability to feel empathy. They did this in hopes of sparing him the death penalty. But the prosecution argued that Ross's actions were deliberate and meticulously planned. They pointed to the fact that he chose his victims carefully, took them to isolated spots, and methodically carried out his crimes. They also emphasized the trauma that he had inflicted on the families of his victims, who had to live with knowing what had been done to their loved ones. In 1987, Michael Ross was found guilty and sentenced to death. But the legal battles didn't end there. His death sentence sparked a series of appeals that lasted for nearly 2 decades, focusing on whether or not he was actually mentally fit enough for execution and whether or not the death penalty was even appropriate in this case. For the families, including Tammy Williams's, it meant that they had to relive their loss every time the case was back in court. After years of appeals, Ross surprised many by waiving his right to further legal challenges in 2004, agreeing to his own execution. Some saw this as a last-ditch effort to control his fate, while others believed that he had finally accepted his punishment. On May 13th, 2005, Michael Ross was executed by lethal injection. He became the first person executed in Connecticut in over 45 years. For the families of his victims, it brought some sense of closure, but of course it could never heal the pain that they had been carrying with them for so many years. His execution also reignited debates in Connecticut around the death penalty, and in 2012, the state abolished it. It was, of course, a controversial shift. Many believed that crimes like his deserved the harshest punishment, while others argue that even somebody as horrible as Michael Ross didn't deserve a state-sanctioned death. Michael Ross's execution brought an end to his violent life, but the pain he caused lives on, as do the memories of his victims. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It helps people find us. Join me tomorrow as we explore another crime that happened on this day in history. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the truth is hidden right below the surface. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!